Welcome to Dear Fans. Donald Trump sat back in his chair, legs crossed, fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. The studio lights cast sharp shadows along the angles of his face, catching the faintest smirk curling at the corner of his mouth. The CNN logo pulsed red behind Kaitlan Collins as she straightened the stack of papers in front of her, though she already knew the questions by heart. This wasn't just another interview, this was a battlefield, and both of them knew it. Outside, Washington lay under the hush of an early evening, the streets moving with the slow rhythm of a city exhausted by politics. Inside, the air was charged, electric. The camera crew moved with quiet precision, adjusting angles, checking sound level. The audience beyond the screen, millions watching from living rooms, bars, airports, waited, some for a confrontation, some for entertainment, and some simply to see the inevitable. Trump was calm, composed. He had done this too many times before to be anything else. His eyes flicked toward Collins, reading her before she could even open her mouth. She was poised, professional, a veteran of difficult interviews, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the controlled grip on her pen. They both knew why they were here. The world had seen the meeting. Trump, sitting in the Oval Office, leaned back in his chair, arms folded across from him. Volodymyr Zelensky, in his dark military sweater, cargo pants, and scuffed boots, looking more like a soldier at a war council than the leader of a nation. No suit, no tie, no attempt at the formality that had defined every leader who had ever stepped into that room before him. To his supporters, it was a symbol of resilience, a reminder that Ukraine was still at war. To Trump, it was something else entirely. Disrespect. Collins knew Trump's thoughts on the matter. The whole world, he had made sure of that. Now her job was to push, to challenge, to force something new out of him. The clock above the camera ticked down the final seconds. A red light blinked on the broadcast had begun. Collins took a breath. Trump simply waited. The words came sharp and controlled. Mr. President. The red light on the camera burned bright. The room, though filled with people, felt like it contained only two: Donald Trump sitting comfortably, and Kaitlan Collins, her expression composed but alert beyond the studio walls. Washington carried on as it always did, but here inside CNN's headquarters, the weight of the moment pressed down on everything. Collins held her pen between her fingers, barely moving. She had interviewed him before. She knew his patterns, the way he deflected, how he controlled the room, even when he wasn't the one asking the questions. But tonight was different. Tonight the stakes were higher. Trump had just met with Volodymyr Zelensky, and the world had seen what happened. The Oval Office had witnessed countless world leaders over the decades, all of them stepping through its doors in dark suits, polished shoes, the weight of their nations on their shoulders. Not this time. Zelensky had arrived in his now iconic military sweater, the same one had worn in front of Congress, in front of world leaders, in front of cameras. No tie, no formality, just the uniform of a man who had defined himself through war. Trump had watched him walk and had taken in the scuffed boots, the casual stance, the way he barely glanced at the room around him. And Trump had smiled, not out of warmth, not out of respect, but because he had already decided what this was, a show. Now sitting across from Collins, he didn't need to say it outright. His silence said enough. She knew she had to push the meeting with President Zelensky. Trump raised a hand, barely emotion, but enough to silence the room. He didn't wear a suit, he said. Collins blinked. He's a wartime president. Trump tilted his head as if considering this, then chuckled. A wartime president? He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Or a man who doesn't know how to lead? Collins stayed still, waiting. Trump let the silence stretch, enjoying the moment before he continued. A leader makes peace, he said. A leader knows when the fight is over. A leader doesn't throw his people into the fire, so he can keep his own story alive. Outside, the city moved on, cars rolling down Constitution Avenue, the last glow of daylight fading into the Pomac. But inside the studio, everything remained frozen. Collins shifted slightly. You believe Ukraine should negotiate with Russia? Trump shrugged. I believe Ukraine should have a president who does, dressed like a soldier while sending other men to die. The words hung in the air, sharp as glass. Collins let them settle before moving forward. You don't believe he's fit to lead? Trump smirked. He's a comedian playing war hero, a man who talks about democracy but begs for money, a man who doesn't understand economics, doesn't understand power. He understands cameras. That's all. Collins inhaled, just enough to steady herself. Many see him as a hero. Trump laughed, and many thought he was funny when he was on TV. He leaned back. Now he's just a joke that's gone on too long. For the first time, Collins Hesitated not because she didn't have a response, but because she knew the weight of what had just been said. Trump didn't move. He let it settle, let the cameras drink it in. Then, just as Collins opened her mouth again, he raised a hand. Once more, you should worry about CNN surviving, he said, not asking me these ridiculous questions. The red light on the camera burned on the silence in the studio, was thick, pressing against the walls like an unseen force. Collins didn't flinch, but the moment lingered, stretching just long enough for the weight of Trump's words to settle into the space between them. The cameras kept rolling. The world kept watching. Trump, as always, was completely at ease. He had said what he wanted to say, and he knew it would spread like wildfire. He didn't need to repeat himself. The message was already out there, already making its way into heave headlines, into comment sections, into the conversations of millions. Collins straightened slightly. She was used to handling difficult interviews, to navigating political landmines, but Trump was different. He didn't follow the rules, he created his own, and tonight, he had set the stage exactly the way he wanted it. You don't think Zelensky is a hero? She asked, her voice steady. Trump exhaled, slow and deliberate. Heroes don't sacrifice their people for their own ego. The words cut through the air, sharp and final. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Collins shifted, flipping through her notes, even though she already knew what she wanted to ask next. You think he's prolonging the war for himself? Trump's expression didn't change. I think he likes the attention. Collins waited, but he didn't say more. It was a tactic, one she recognized but couldn't counter. He knew that letting his words hang in the air was more powerful than any long-winded argument. He knew people would take those few sentences and run with them, dissect them, twist them, spread them. She glanced at her notes again, searching for an opening. Many in Ukraine see him as their last hope. Trump smirked, almost as if he was waiting for that line. Then Ukraine is in trouble. The studio was silent. Even the camera crew seemed to have stopped moving, their attention locked onto the unfolding moment. Collins held her ground. What would you have done differently? Trump's smile widened. This was the question he had been waiting for. I would have ended it before it started. A pause, then with just a touch of amusement, he added, that's what real leaders do. Collins hesitated. You mean a deal with Russia? Trump shrugged, as if the answer was too obvious to even discuss. A deal, a negotiation, something other than endless war. He leaned forward slightly. But that wouldn't make for a good show, would it? Collins kept her face neutral, but she knew exactly what he was implying. Zelensky, the showman, the entertainer, the man who built his career on applause and had learned how to chase it ever since the war had given him a stage, and Trump was suggesting he wasn't ready to step off. She pressed on. You think he's playing a role? Trump chuckled. I think he's wearing a costume. It was a simple sentence, but it carried weight. The military sweater, the boots, the unshaven fade. Zelensky's war uniform had become his identity. It had become part of the narrative, part of the branding, and Trump, with just a few words, had ripped it apart. Collins tapped her pen against her notepad, thinking. She knew that every second of this interview would be dissected, that the spin would begin before the broadcast even ended. But there was one more thing she needed to ask. You don't think he deserves the support of the United States? Trump let the question hang, then finally said, I think Americans deserve a leader who puts them first. Collins frowned slightly, and Zelensky. Trump's expression was unreadable. I think he should buy a suit. The studio was silent again, but this time it felt different. The interview was shifting. It wasn't about Ukraine anymore. It wasn't even about Zelensky. It was about Trump, his vision, his strategy, his version of leadership. Collins glanced at the clock above the camera. They were running out of time. One last question you still haven't answered. If you were in office, would you tell Putin to withdraw from Ukraine? Trump smiled, slow and deliberate. If I were in office, he wouldn't have gone in to begin with. A calculated answer, the kind that left no room for follow-ups, no room for argument. Collins knew she wouldn't get more out of him. The broadcast was nearly over, but Trump wasn't done yet. He shifted in his chair, his smirk returning, and delivered the final blow. You should worry about CNN surviving, he said, not asking me these ridiculous questions. The red light on the camera blinked. The interview was over, but the conversation had just begun. The red light on the camera turned off. The silence that followed was not the usual studio silence, that kind filled with hurried whispers, rustling papers, and technicians adjusting equipment. This was something heavier. It sat between them like an unseen weight. Collins exhaled slowly, keeping her expression neutral. She had known this would be difficult. Trump had not disappointed. He had turned the interview into exactly what he wanted, a performance, a spectacle, and worst of all, she knew it would work. His words would spread not just through headlines, but in viral clips, in political debates, in dinner table arguments across America. Trump stretched his legs, slightly adjusting his cuffs. He looked amused, as if he had just completed a particularly entertaining game. But there was something else beneath it, something sharper, something more calculated. One of the producers' st forward were clear. Trump stood. He didn't rush. He never rushed. He adjusted his suit jacket, smoothed his tie, and cast a final glance at Collins. You tried, he said. She met his eyes. You didn't answer everything. His smirk widened. I answered what mattered, she could have argued, but what was the point? He had done what he came to do. He had planted the seeds of doubt, not just about Zelensky, but about leadership, about war, about who truly deserved respect. And he had done it effortlessly. Collins sat down her notepad as Trump turned and strode toward the exit. A few aides followed, but they barely spoke. The air in the studio remained charged, as if the interview had left something behind that couldn't quite be shaken. She glanced at the screen where the replay was already rolling. The last words hung in the air, reverberating louder than anything else. You should worry about CNN surviving, not asking me these ridiculous questions. Collins let out a slow breath. She had done her job. She had pressed, she had challenged, but Trump had done his job too. He had dominated. Somewhere at that very moment, the debate was already raging on social media, on news panels, in White House meetings. Some would call him ruthless. Some would call him right. Some would call him dangerous. And Trump, he wouldn't care what they called him, because in the end, he had made them talk about him, and that more than anything was the point. Like this video and subscribe this channel. Thank you.